Hey everybody, I've been experimenting with different process improvements with regards to oxidation. So I decided to brew 4 different batches of beer from the same recipe and just kind of vary the process approach. You can see here a list of all the different things I did. You can pause it if you want. I know there's a lot of information, but basically it's the same recipe 4 different times. Okay, the first process is the low oxygen process. That's a method where you attempt to keep all the materials away from oxygen throughout the entire brewing process. Start with pre-boiling our strike water to remove all the oxygen from it. Chill it down to dough-in temps. Here I'm adding lactic acid. I think it was about 4 or 5 milliliters. And then now I'm going to add the sulfites, which the sulfites give us protection from any oxygen that's left over or might show up through the process. I have milled the grain into my Wilson Brewer bag. Put that down into my anvil foundry. I'm also using a false bottom with the anvil foundry that helps with the whole process and the recirculation with this unit. Okay, now I'm going to take my strike water, which has been deoxygenated, and we're going to do a process which is called underletting, which means we're going to slowly add the water from underneath the grain bed rather than what traditionally has been pouring the grain into the water. What this does is it limits the exposure of the grain to the water to small amounts at a time, and that gives the chance for the sulfites, which we added, to step into the process and kind of slow down or limit the exposure to oxygen to the malt compounds. Here's a little time lapse of the whole dough-in process. I'm still slowly adding the water in. It takes I do it for about 10 or 15 minutes, so it's a very slow process. And I start stirring just when the water level goes above the grain bed. With this system, I really only stir once in the beginning, so I try to do pretty thorough job, but also try to be very smooth as to not create very many bubbles. Now I'm going to put my mash cap on. For the length of the mash, this will sort of seal it and limit any kind of exposure. We run the recirculation through the cap. And then I'll add the little lid I made for the top of the foundry, and this is just a way to have an opening that I can sort of make small or larger. I also use it when I'm boiling. Okay, I took a reading every about 10 minutes throughout this mash just to show you a little bit what the wort looks like, how clear it is, how not clear it is, its color. I'll be doing this for all 4 batches. You can see how it gets a little clearer as the mash progresses, and this is after the mash out. Fairly clear. Okay, so my mash is complete now. I'm going to run off the mash over to that separate vessel, which is a bottom drain kegel. And what this does is it's a lauter instead of just a normal brew in the bag where you take the bag out. And it's an attempt to make the cleanest wort possible with the system. So I'm just draining the excess. I use these little inline sort of hose clamps, and they've really been a great find. You know, it allows me to move hoses around, and it keeps the end closed. And it's really easy just to open or close it. So, that silicone tubing still has a bunch of mash wort in it, but it's sealed, so it's really easy to move around. So it allows me to make my system sort of dual use. So I'm going to hook this up right here, and then I will drain it out away from the brew in the bag setup in the foundry over to this sort of holding pot. Always use a clamp, by the way. Make sure we don't get any extra bubbles coming in. Okay, here we are starting the flow. Try to go very slow at the beginning. Let's not add anything else to the wort. As you can see, we're getting nice, clear liquid coming through. That's the way we like it. This step is a little bit extra, but it definitely leaves all the stuff behind from the mash that you really don't want to carry over into your boil. And I'm adding a solid mash cap onto that because as it sits there, I'm going to clean out the mash tun or the foundry, and I just want to keep it covered. Now this is the remains of what was left over from the mash. You can see not too much sediment, which is a good sign. Okay, so now I'm gonna run the liquid from the full kegel back over to the foundry for the boil. I just change my hose direction and use the same pump. Run it back into the foundry, which now becomes the boil kettle. You can see the liquid is very clear. That's what we want. And once again, cap it. Try to never have any exposed vert anywhere. Okay, so here's what the vort looks like coming up to boil. You can see we have a really nice bright white layer of foam here. Really don't see much junk, or tag is another word for it. Very clean. That's a sign that we've done a fairly good job keeping the oxygen at bay. Do a little time lapse here just to show you. I want to, with all four of these batches, sort of demonstrate the hot break. You can see how that comes up. It stays that nice white color, and when it does calm down, you can see there's not too much left over. There's not too much on the sidewalls, and we pretty much go back to clear liquid pretty quickly. Also try to keep a low intensity boil, keep the thermal load down. You can see that once I took that lid off and the bubbles went away, that we have gone back to pretty low intensity boil. That's why I'm going to use my lid here, and it'll stay there for the rest of the boil with just that window cut out. And here's an image of the final beer from my kegerator. Okay, our second process is sort of a traditional brew in the bag approach. Using the false bottom there, it'll be underneath the bag. For this batch of beer, I will do nothing with regards to oxygen mitigation. I'm just going to put the bag in. I'm going to add the strike water, heat it up, pour in the grain, just like so many of us have done for many years. I haven't treated the strike water. It's just filtered water out of my tap. Just a normal pouring into the grain. I use a pretty wide mill gap 0.038, and I mill very slowly so I don't get too much dust. I found that works better for my system. We've got to squeeze out that last little bit. Okay, then we're just going to stir it in. Now, I think one thing to notice right away is that the amount of foam on top of the grain bed or the mash here compared to the low oxygen batch. See how that foam has stayed there about 10 minutes into the mash. I'm going to start the recirculation. Slow it down a little bit there, and then we'll let that sit. Just good normal. All these beers were a just normal single infusion with a mash out. Okay, here are the images from throughout the mash. You can see we're pretty cloudy at the beginning here, but this batch really cleared up. I'd say out of the four, this was the clearest. You can see as we get to the end here, it's quite clear. I think that's rather interesting. And you can see there, that's really clear from the mash. Okay, time to lift the bag out. Okay, here's an image of the wort coming up to the boil, and already you can see that we have a quite a different color on our foam. I think in doing these four batches, I really kind of came across this striking difference, and it's something I've learned that is kind of the one thing that's separating all these different processes. But anyway, you can see how we're starting to get darker and darker. That the added heat is bringing up the sediment that was left over from the brew in the bag up to the top. And you can see we're going to break. There we go, right there. You can see there's quite a bit going on there. You can see how it doesn't want to disappear. It's just hanging around, lingering. Has that sort of off-white cocoa color. And here's the finished beer from the kegerator. Very clear. Okay, on to the third batch. This batch I'm sort of doing a combination of brew in the bag as well as some low oxygen techniques. Putting in the false bottom. This is out the night before brew day, and I'm preparing the water with what we call the YOS method, which is the yeast oxygen scavenging method. Basically, we're using dry baker's yeast to eat up any of the oxygen in your strike water. You can just put the yeast in there and let it sit overnight, or even as little as an hour or two, and they will scavenge the oxygen. This method is an alternative to pre-boiling. They both end up at the same result, which is pretty much zero dissolved oxygen in your strike water when you're ready to brew. That's a mixture of equal parts sugar and yeast. And I have another video on my YouTube channel here about this method if you want to check that out. It's very simple and very effective. Okay, so the strike water is up to temperature. And for this batch, I'm going to put the brew bag in, and we're going to dump it in just as the traditional brew in the bag approach is. The only difference here is that I'm going to also add some sulfites. So this is sort of like a combination low oxygen approach as well as traditional brew in the bag approach. All right, here's me adding the lactic acid. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of that strike water, add the sulfites to a small container, and I'm going to mix those up well, and then add that liquid back in. Oops, dropped it. I'm doing this because I really don't have any recirculation going on, so I want the sulfites to be really mixed in well. If I just put the crystals in there, they might just sink to the bottom. Okay, here comes the grain. You can try to make an effort to limit, any kind of agitation by pouring the grain slowly, but that's kind of impossible. You start off slow and then eventually you just say, let's pour it in. Once again, you can see not too much flour or dust in the crush. Give it a little stir up here. And we'll put the mash cap in place and start the recirculation. Here are the samples from throughout the mash. You can tell the color's a little bit lighter than the brew in the bag, not too much, just a little bit. But it's also not as clear, which is quite interesting. Okay, so my mash is complete now. Close the inline clamp and just draining the extra fluid out. Now, normally I would run the liquid off to the holding pot, but for this batch we're going to continue with the brew in the bag approach, which means we're going to lift the bag out. I'm going to try to do it in a very slow manner. So I'm going to take it 3-4 clicks at a time, let it sit for a minute. 3-4 clicks at a time, sit for a minute. 3-4 clicks at a time, sit for a minute. So we're trying to do a very slow exit from the bag, try to keep most of the sediment in there, try to get the clear as forward as possible, and also keep the line that it drains below the liquid level, so you don't have any kind of agitation that would add to any oxygen ingress. Okay, so here's what our foam looks like. I'm going to cover it, bring it up to boil. Okay, so we're a lot closer to the boil temp, so I'm going to show you what it looks like. And interestingly, we have a combination of some white, and then we also have some sort of discolored foam there. So that tells me we're somewhere in the middle with regards to how much oxygen we kept away from the malt. It's interesting to see how the hot break forms. Once the time lapse is finished, we'll take the lid off. Okay, here's everything coming up to temperature. You can see it's sort of getting a little bit darker in those areas. It's pushing up all the stuff that we left in the boil, which you normally wouldn't have. But you can see there's an underpinning of really white foam. So we kind of got two things going on at once here. Pretty white, which is good, and you see it's going to dissipate pretty quickly. And here's a picture of the final beer. Nice and bright. Okay, batch number 4. This is pre-boiling, adding the sulfites, and also underletting. So a lot of tenets of the first low oxygen approach, but we're going to still use the brew in the bag sort of down-lauter approach. Here's the underlet time lapse and the one and only stir at the beginning of the process. Okay, so the mash is complete here. I didn't take any image samples throughout the mash because it's pretty much the same as batch number 3. We're just going to get to the nitty-gritty of the hot break. So once again for this batch, I took painful consideration on going slow and trying to keep everything draining below the water line or wort line. This process is actually a little bit more efficient for me because you skip the whole process of cleaning out the boil kettle before you bring the liquid back into the boil kettle. But the holding pot method definitely produces a lot clearer wort. Alright, so here's an image of our foam coming up to boil temperature. And a fair amount of colored or discolored material in there. That's not optimal, but as you can see, as we come up to temperature, we will form a fair amount of white foam, which is a good sign. Getting the dark, crusty stuff appearing. Yeah, a little bit more than batch number 3, but we're nice and white in the middle. That's good. I like to scoop all that junk away. We don't really need it. But you can see it dissipates fairly quickly. Goes back to just the exposed beer in there boiling, or vort. There we go. And here's an image of the final beer. As you can see, nice and clear, nice and bright. Okay, let's move on to sort of a recap section. First, we're going to start with comparing all the color of the final beers. There's batch number 1, batch number 2, batch number 3, and then batch number 4. You see they're pretty similar with the brew in the bag batch, but just a little bit darker. Okay, next I'd like to put all the hot breaks on the screen for you to see. This is a very telling scene. You can see the low oxygen batch is bright white, and you can see the brew in the bag batch has the dark sort of mocha underpinning of its color. The other two are kind of a mix. We have some white and we have some dark patches. But I think this is the best demonstration of the difference between the 4 processes, or really the 3 processes, since 3 and 4 are pretty similar. You can see how long it takes just to get the second batch to calm down over there. Pretty interesting. Okay, next we have a little test I made with an apple, and this is just to kind of demonstrate what oxidation does, just what it looks like. We're all familiar with an apple. It can sit there for very long period of time in its natural state. You know, once we open it up, it starts to immediately oxidize. So I thought, well, it'd be interesting to track visually what path the oxidation takes, and then sort of treat the different parts of the apple in different ways. So I'm taking half of it and just putting it back together, thinking that, oh, well, it'll be sort of less exposed. And then I'll have a single slice out there just sitting untreated on its own. Next, I'm going to take a slice and wrap it in saran wrap in the hopes of maybe sealing it up away from the oxygen exposure. And then last, I'm going to take one slice and I'm going to sprinkle sulfites all over the slice. Oh, we have a little quality control expert came in. See if it passed. There. Okay, thank you. So there we are, sprinkling on the sulfites, and we'll see it's pretty much what we're asking the sulfites to do on our batch of beer, is to protect our raw materials from oxidation. So this is kind of a straight example of that, and I'm going to set these up here. We have a good view of them, and then set up a time lapse for about 30 plus minutes. Okay, there goes our time lapse. And it's quite interesting. You can see this tracking that the saran wrapped slice is already just totally brown. Okay, so let's pick apart the 4 pieces that were shielded or sealed a little bit, and you can see they still got kind of brown, so there's really nowhere to hide from this oxygen stuff. Pretty interesting. You can see the slice with the sulfites is still as bright as right when we sliced it. Okay, on to my tasting notes to these 4 beers. First is the low oxygen batch, and I would say out of all the beers, this one is the lightest. It's the most balanced. It's very easy drinking. It doesn't have any overhead as compared to these other beers. Okay, second is the brew in the bag, or what we call high dough brewing. This beer is a good beer. It's fine. It just has this sort of acrid flavor. It's a little bit heavier, and it's got this harshness to it. I can't attribute it to hops. It just seems like it's a harsh bitterness that's there that isn't in the low oxygen beer. Then we have the third batch, these kind of combination batches, the third and the fourth. They have some attributes of a low oxygen beer. They're very light, pretty easy drinking. They do have a little bit of that bitterness, that acrid taste of the brew in the bag batch, but not a ton. I'd say maybe a third of it. So it's a pretty nice compromise. And then the fourth batch is very similar to the third batch. Still very drinkable. It's pretty balanced. It carries over some of that oxidation bitterness, but overall pretty nice beer. Okay, my final thoughts. Yes, low oxygen brewing is worth it. There is a difference. It's very important to start with zero oxygen in your strike water. The sulfites are our friends. They really kind of make it all happen. Clean mash wort is very important. It does make a flavor difference. Brew in the bag techniques can work, but they are held back by the retained sediment as shown in the video. It's tough to get really clean hot break, and it does transfer to a flavor difference. And speaking of flavor, oxidation is a flavor, and it's something you don't want in your beer. It's got kind of a bitter, acrid taste where you'd rather have just transparent flavor from your recipe.